Hello and welcome everybody to this presentation hosted by the Partnership of Historic Boston's. Everyone's hearing me, right? Everyone can hear? All right, good. I see you nodding. I'm Lori Rogers-Stokes, and I'm representing the Partnership of Historic Boston's here tonight as the moderator for our talk. Thank you all for joining us here from all the many places that you are beaming in from. We're going to hear from Tad Baker and get his slides and all of his information. I was just getting a little preview of it. It's pretty amazing. For about 40 minutes, and then there will be questions at the end of our time, the last 20 minutes. Go ahead as Tad goes along through his talk and put your questions into the chat. And then when we're ready for Q&A, I will be going in there and pulling them out for Tad to answer. I think that's the best setup for as many people as we have. We're up over 100 people who are attending, which is great. And I don't want to hold you up, but I'm going to introduce Tad. Tad Baker, professor of history at Salem State University and the award-winning author or co-author of 6 books on the history and archaeology of early New England, including the magnificent book, A Storm of Witchcraft, The Salem Trials and the American Experience. Tad has served as a consultant and on-air expert for historical documentaries ranging from PBS and the Smithsonian to TLC and the History Channel, back when those shows did actual history programming. The majority of his scholarship has focused on 17th century Maine and New Hampshire, what the states that are now known as these states. And he's directed excavations on the Chadbourne site, which was a trading post and sawmill in South Berwick, Maine from 1643 to 1690. And this work has been the focus of the Old Berwick Historical Society's 2017 exhibit, Forgotten Frontier, Untold Stories of the Piscataqua. Tad's currently part of an international team of archaeologists and historians in the Landscapes of Indenture project, which studies Scottish prisoners of war who were transported to this region in the 17th century and the relationship between forced labor, the exploitation of natural resources, and environmental change in early New England. We are recording the presentation. It will be posted within some very decent interval after we're done tonight on the Partnership of Historic Boston's website, which is at historicbostons.org. And you know that because that's how you got here. So before we go ahead and get started, we know that we're all coming here virtually from many different places, all of which were and are Indigenous places. And so as we begin our talk here about many places that were and are Indigenous, we keep in mind what we can do today to be in partnership with Indigenous people who are also studying history in those regions. With that, I'm going to turn it right over to Tad.
Thanks, Lori. It's a pleasure to be back with you folks, with you and Gina, and looking forward to this. See if I can get my... All right. Can people see my first slide there? Yeah, okay, great. So yes, this is a new project, sort of a new take on some research that many of us have been ongoing for a number of years. And I will start off right by saying that yes, you see some of my teammates here in the Landscape of Indenture project. We'll talk more about that project in a little bit after we cover some background. But that is to say too that a lot of these slides and ideas are bits borrowed from presentations and the works of some of my colleagues in this. So this in many ways is really kind of a team effort from people on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think Lori asked me to come back and talk about this because I think the last time I spoke, I raised the possibility of, Puritan New England with a question mark, because my reaction is it wasn't necessarily entirely Puritan. It certainly wasn't new, and it certainly wasn't just the English. We're talking about a wide range of diversities of peoples: Quakers, Baptists, Anglican Royalists, Antinomians. As Lori pointed out, the Native American presence has been here for at least 12,000 years, or since time immemorial, depending on which version of the past you want to use. And also, too, there are other people that are part of the story, too, and that, in fact, really, 17th century New England was a pretty diverse place, believe it or not. Africans, diverse Europeans, including, yes, in this case, Scottish prisoners of war. And you see some of the artifacts and peoples a part of that diversity on screen here. Particularly, too, I would say that diversity is particularly rich in northern New England, which is one reason why I do enjoy studying this. So in this case, too, I guess I sort of include Essex County, Massachusetts as being northern New England as well. So what I want to do is talk about these Scots prisoners of war, and particularly to start by talking about the War of the Three Kingdoms. I know that sounds a little bit like something out of Game of Thrones, but it's actually sort of the broader, more inclusive term for what we all used to call the English Civil War, or then we realized there was more than one. It became English Civil Wars. But in fact, actually, we're talking about the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, the related conflicts that include an English Civil War, but also between England and Scotland, and ultimately involving Ireland as well, spanning from 1639 to 1653. And so a little bit of background on this process and where our Scots prisoners of war become prisoners of war and fit into our story. At the end of what really is usually called the Second English Civil War, it sort of culminates when Charles I is executed by Parliament in January 1649. And at this point, Oliver Cromwell, the leading general of the New Model Army, consolidates his power and turns his attention to, shall we say, quelling Ireland and Scotland. And in fact, he will, invade Scotland in summer of 1650, when the Scots start to raise an army. It really raised the royal standard. The Scots owe their allegiance to the Stuart kings of Scotland, who of course had become kings of England as well, starting with James I. And they remain loyal and particularly do not take the beheading of Charles I particularly well, and rally to the banner of his son, the future Charles II. Cromwell marches north into Scotland, and about 30, 40 miles southeast of Edinburgh, his army meets the Scots army, commanded by David Leslie. And in fact, Leslie has a much larger force. They have the high ground. It actually looks like they could have probably just starved Cromwell to death, but they choose not to do so. And in fact, actually, unfortunately, Leslie's army turns out is really a bunch of mostly untrained boys, very few experienced warriors. And when the attack actually starts, within an hour, the battle is over, and it's been a horrific defeat for the Scots. Cromwell has probably taken 8,000 or 9,000 men prisoner, and the rout is really on. And in that sense, it's almost a disastrous victory for Cromwell, because there's so many Scots, he's not entirely sure what to do with them. He will let 1,000 or two at least go, the elderly, the really young, the sick, the wounded. But then ends up with about, at least 4,000 prisoners left, and he's not entirely sure what to do with them. So he starts marching them south. He's made arrangements to basically lock them up in Durham Cathedral. And they start a 120-mile march from Dunbar to Durham, what will end up being really essentially a death march. It's sort of organized by Sir Arthur Heselrigg, who's one of the villains of this story. He really runs the north of England for Cromwell. And while he does take what effort he can to look after the prisoners, honestly, there's not a lot to be had. This is the Scottish borderlands and northern England at the end of the Civil Wars. There is not much food to be had, not much sympathy for the Scots amongst the English, and it's a death march. And while some may have escaped, surely probably close to 1,000 or more just perish along the way of malnutrition, of overexertion. A lot of them had probably been sick to begin with. And they finally do arrive in Durham. I think it's actually about September 11th, and are locked up in the cathedral. If you've ever been to Durham, beautiful, beautiful city, one of the world's most amazing cathedrals. And right next to it in the foreground here at the top of the hill, you see the old castle. And here's what the cathedral looks today on the inside. The picture above is what it would have looked like in the 1650s. In the outbreak of the Civil Wars, the cathedral had basically been vacated. It was by the government, or by the parliamentarians. So it's sitting empty in 1650. So it's the perfect place to house the remaining Scots who make it there. And then down below, you'll see a view of the cathedral today. Truly a remarkable place. Well, things go from bad to worse for the survivors. Heselrigg reports at the end of October, he says, there are about 500 sick in the castle. They've been moved out of the cathedral into the castle, and about 600 yet in health in the cathedral, most of which are probably Highlanders, they being hardier than the rest. And about 1,600 are dead and buried. So they've been locked up in the cathedral for about 7 weeks. That's about 30, 32 on average dying every day. They don't have much food, though Heselrigg does try to provide some for them. They don't have much wood or anything to start fires to keep warm. They don't really have bathrooms per se, though the Scots try to organize that space apparently to sort of set up one end kind of as the privies. Pretty ghastly conditions, and they're dying literally like flies. And so unfortunately, there aren't that many left of those 4,000 who start south within a couple of months. Flash forward ahead to 2013, and 28 of those dead were actually found. Now, if you're looking at the map on the left here, you'll see at the bottom is the cathedral and the cathedral grounds, and then the top of the view is Durham Castle, which today, that and the intermediary ground is all part of Durham University, one of the foremost research universities in the United Kingdom and the world for that matter. In 2013, they began construction right here where that yellow square is inside the red circle. They broke ground for a new cafe for the Durham University library. And when they did that, their backhoe started hitting human remains. And you can see down below the completed cafe down below. And that's the bad news. The good news is Durham has one of the finest and most sophisticated archaeology departments in the world. And my now good friend Chris Gerard was sort of the archaeologist in charge of monitoring the project, and he got a phone call about human remains, and they were on the job almost immediately. And in the end, they excavated here 2 mass graves with a total of 28 of the dead, and bodies just really thrown into a pit, very clearly a mass grave, no clothes, no possessions, not buried in an east-west access in traditional Christian fashion. And basically, after extensive research, they were able to figure out that these indeed were some of the victims of Dunbar. They did that in a number of ways. One thing they can do is isotopic analysis on the bones recovered. And we're basically, if you plot the amount of strontium and oxygen isotopes in your bones, which it basically is captured as you live, captures those elements that are local to where you are, particularly through like groundwater and food. It'll give a unique signature of what part of the world you were born and raised and living in. And in this case, if you see here inside that blue box in the middle of the screen, the yellow dots indicate the mass grave, and the gray dots are sort of an English population. And essentially that whole area inside the blue bar there, about 80% of these fellows came from Scotland. We know that. And we also know roughly the time from radiocarbon dating. You'll see here plots out that there's a 94% probability that they died between 1625 and 1660. So if you're looking at mostly boys and young men between the ages of about 14 and 25 in a mass grave, no signs of battle casualties or wounds or hanging or any violent death like that. And all the pieces put together, and as Chris Gerard and his research and his team have determined, these are some of those victims of the battle who didn't make it. And to think about it, these 2 mass graves probably represented about maybe 1 day's worth of the dead in this really horrible fate for the men. They were actually able to try to, what archaeologists like to try to do is literally put flesh on the bones. And then in this case, through, again, some very sophisticated analyses of literally the kind of work that people on CSI do, they're able to reconstruct one of the faces. And what we see here is what one of those young men may have looked like who never made it home. Can't be sure about the color of his eyes or his hair, but as they say, hopefully if his mother were to see him across the room, he would recognize him. So that's the kind of thing that we like to do as archaeologists, is to really try to breathe life back into people and also to tell their story. And particularly a lot of this, the history of the Scots before and after the battle, and also the archaeology is told in the book Lost Lives, New Voices, a really wonderful award-winning book by Chris Gerard, Pam Graves, and the rest of the team at Durham University who were responsible for the excavations. And if you're interested on this story, it is probably the first place to go. Really wonderful book that I highly recommend. At the end of the project, Diane Rappaport and I nearly wrote a book on the Scots, oh gosh, over 20 years ago, and it never quite happened. For some reason, my agent didn't seem to think at the time that it was a really a project that would be worthwhile. It couldn't sell many books, but I think, judging by like the audience we have tonight and other times, I think it's a story that people are really taken by. It's a very compelling story. Anyhow, so I actually was in touch with Chris and the gang and had hosted them over here on a trip to the US to try to meet up with some of the descendants. And when I returned the favor in May 2017, I was fortunate enough to be there when the memorial plaque was dedicated in the cafe, and also a new plaque dedicated in the cathedral with a special evensong dedicated to the Scots. So there's a real strong element of commemoration in Durham that remains to this day. And by the way, the remains were all reburied sort of with advice and consultation of the local community and the Scottish community as well. So what happened to those who did survive? Because we think there may have been 1,000 or so maybe that survived, give or take. They were put to work in a variety of activities. You can't send them home because there's the fear that they will just rise up in rebellion again. So you put them to work in various projects. A number of them, probably who were experienced salt makers, were sent down to the mouth of the Tyne below Newcastle to make salt from salt water. A large contingent of them were sent down to Cambridgeshire to help a large public works project, the draining and reclamation of the Cambridgeshire Fens, which you can see below. That's a small number of them. Others, though, they really want to get out of England and out of Scotland, so they, again, won't cause any more problems. So we do know that a contingent of them are shipped out with Cromwell's forces to fight in Ireland, where Cromwell really is pulling the same kind of trick on the Irish as he did to the Scottish, with really sort of taking over their lands, and again, in many cases, exporting people. Others are fought to fight in France as mercenaries. Rumors are that some were sent to the Barbados. We don't have any good evidence of that, and in fact, Chris strongly thinks not, because here's the problem. Barbados at the time was a royalist stronghold. Cromwell and Parliament do not want to do anything to help the royalist cause anywhere. The last thing they want to do is to send young royalist men who are loyal to the king to a place like Barbados, where they might be responsible for being part of a mutiny. We do know, though, however, that being Barbados was a common affliction, where many people were sent into, men were sort of sent into, maybe taken to the pub and then knocked over the head and then shipped to Barbados in captivity to serve out their time. We do know that other losers of the English Civil War were shipped there from time to time, and particularly the Irish. And particularly if you have Scots and Irish in Barbados, there's a to this day, their descendants there, they're known as redlegs, which when you have that Irish and Scotch complexion and you're out in the sugar fields processing sugar cane hot summer days, you get blisteringly red legs. Likewise, there was an effort made to ship some to Virginia. Again, doesn't seem to be likely because in 1650, 1651, Virginia is a royalist stronghold. You know, there's a reason why the University of Virginia's mascot are the Cavaliers. Some of them may have made it there later. That's certainly possible, but probably not directly. So the largest number that we do know, that we kind of have a record of, are 150 who are shipped to New England to work in indentured servitude. And we know this because we have here the orders from the Council of State, November 11th, 1650, in order to deliver 150 Scots to Augustine Walker, master of the ship Unity, which will sail for Boston. And particularly, they're working in close concert with the agents of the Saugus Iron Works. The Unity is a Boston ship built by 1646. She's a ketch, which would have looked a bit like the ship on the left. I will tell you, 150 passengers on a ketch like this would have been a very unpleasant passage. We don't know of any that died on the way, but then again, we don't have a complete list either, so it's hard to say. But it was a pretty quick passage. They were actually there in, I think, about 5 weeks, 4 or 5 weeks, which is a pretty quick passage, particularly in early winter in New England. We do not have a passenger list, but we do have lists from Saugus and other documents, so we're able to reconstruct who these men were with passing certainty. But in some cases, we don't have every name, and that's certainly a problem. Unfortunately, 1 year to the day after the Battle of Dunbar, we see the ultimate battle of the end of the War of the Three Kingdoms, the Battle of Worcester, when the Scottish army, led by Leslie and Charles II, have invaded England. And in Worcester, again, Cromwell again routs them. And it's actually, Cromwell refers to it as his crowning glory. It is the last battle in the Isles for at least in England and Scotland of the conflict. And this time, 250 more Scots get the same treatment, though not quite as bad a death march and no locking up in the cathedral. But again, 250 Scots arrive in the winter late 1651, early 1652. I think it's January 52. Arrive in Massachusetts as well. So that's a total of about 400 Scots between these two lots. And of course, it's safe to send them to Massachusetts because Massachusetts is run by Puritans, who are the allies of Cromwell and Parliament. And upon arrival, many go to work for the Saugus Iron Works. The rest are sort of jobbed out and placed by the Saugus Iron Works. It's a good profit involved here. It costs about £5 to ship these men across, and they are sold, essentially. Their indentured servant contracts are sold for £25 to £30, and they will receive their freedom only after serving an indenture, a term of service, for 5 to 7 years. If you're wondering what that is, an indenture essentially is a contract, and it's called an indenture because it's the original two-part form. There's 2 copies of a signed contract, which are cut in top at the half, where it has been these curved indented lines. So in other words, you could literally take, and then 1 copy is given to the master, 1 copy is given to the servant, and you could literally put the 2 pieces together. The indents would fit together, hence an indentured servant and indentured servant contract. Indentured servants, in many ways, have very little control over their lives, but let's face it, at least knowing you're going to be free in 5 to 7 years is a far better fate than being enslaved. But still not what healthy young Scottish men would prefer to be doing with their lives. So other Scots are sold to work in the lumber industry of the Piscataqua region of Maine and New Hampshire. So there's Boston down in the left-hand corner, and then Lynn, where the Saugus Iron Works is located. And then if we're going to go up here to the Piscataqua region, where I'm going to sort of focus on the fellows for the rest of my talk. Now, the Scottish prisoners were scattered throughout New England. We know some even end up in places like, Long Island and Block Island and Connecticut and Rhode Island, Western Massachusetts. But the ones that I really want to focus in on, the one that we're sort of focusing in on this project in large part, are the fellows who end up working in the sawmills and the lumber industry of Maine and New Hampshire. So here's the map of the region drawn by Colonel John Scott about 1665. And you can see here New Hampshire on the left side of the Piscataqua and Great Bay, and Maine on the right. Now this map was actually drawn. If you see on the left, there's a key showing the location of the 15 sawmills in the region. And so it's really a map of the natural resources. This is a huge area of timber. It's where they're sawing down mast trees, they're building ships, and frankly, they need labor to run these sawmills to cut down the trees. And so this is where you got some nice, healthy, young indentured servants to carry out that work for you. Some over in Exeter, New Hampshire, working for the mills of Nicholas Lisson. I should point out, Exeter was originally founded by Reverend John Wheelwright, the leader of the Antinomians, who's expelled from Massachusetts in 1637 and will move north to found Exeter. That a lot of the people who settle in Maine and New Hampshire are not Puritans. Matter of fact, they go there to sort of escape from the Puritans. To the west, and at Oyster River, what is now Durham, New Hampshire, location University of New Hampshire. Valentine Hill has a 7 or 8 Scots at least. He puts to work on his sawmill on the Oyster River, right in the middle of downtown Durham these days. Over in the Berwicks, actually it was a town known as, it was really all part of Kittery. We see there was Kittery, Elliott, and Berwick was all Kittery at the time. And particularly Richard Leader, who would formerly run the Saugus Ironworks, has developed a new sawmill called the Great Works up on the Great Works River in what's now South Berwick, Maine. And he gets a number of Scots up there as well, too. So a lot of these men are sort of doled out throughout the region to do, again, that sort of hard, difficult work. And I also want to point out one other Scot here. On the York River, the upper part of York becomes known as Scotland because when these men do become free in the late 1650s, many of them will end up settling in the upper part of the York River, given land there in the area that's still to this day referred to as Scotland. Now, what I really want to talk about is how different, and what fascinates me is how different these Scots are, that they really would have been square pegs and round holes who would have stood out in so many different ways from the traditional English and Puritan neighbors, right? Language. The Lowlanders would have spoke Scots. If you think you know Scots, it's kind of like 17th century English, but think Auld Lang Syne. And if you actually try to sing all the verses of Auld Lang Syne, you'll understand most of it, but then you'll come across words like Auld Lang Syne, which you have to go scrambling for a dictionary, basically, old times gone. These fellows would have gotten along okay, but they certainly would have had accents and would have spoken a little differently. Some of these fellows who were Highlanders, we're not quite sure how many there were, but certainly some were, would have spoken Scottish Gaelic as their first language, probably, right? So they would have had a more difficult time communicating. Religion. These guys are not Puritans. Now, most of them are Presbyterians. As a matter of fact, the army at Dunbar had been a Covenant or a Presbyterian army. And Presbyterians are Calvinists, but they're a different kind of Calvinists. They don't believe in the idea of a congregation where the congregation runs itself. They believe that the congregation needs to answer to the presbyters, to the elders of the church, sort of a council of elders. So they have very different ideas about how a church should be governed, right? And some of these fellows as Highlanders could have even been Catholic. We do know that, in the Highlands of Scotland, as late as the 1650s, there were still Catholic priests actively working there. So it's certainly possible that there may have been some Catholics who ended up coming over here as well. Politically, each one of these fellows, by taking up arms against Cromwell and Parliament towards the standard of their king for religion and kingdom, would have been royalists who would have despised the Puritans, and frankly, vice versa. They would have had severe political differences. Now, interesting thing, of course, because on the one hand, perhaps is the worst thing that this can happen to a young man, to be separated completely from his family. Some of these men left wives and children back home, never to see them again. Even when they're freed in New England, they are still in exile because Cromwell is still in power. And even after that, it's a long, expensive trip home. They don't know what the reception will be. And ultimately, though, none of them went home, probably because they realized their misfortune really was a pretty good deal, because these were men of modest means back in Scotland, rarely from land-owning families. They, for the most part, would have had nothing and would have had no chance to prosper and to own their own farms. And pretty much every one of these men in New England gets that chance, because pretty much every town on the frontier, at least, is willing to grant 50 acres or more to anybody who is willing to come work. And these fellows certainly were willing to do that. These were the hardy, the fit, the survivors, and really were destined for the most part to do pretty well over here. I think it's interesting too, because a lot of them, even those on the New Hampshire side, tend to migrate to Maine. I think they do that in part to get together. Now, by the way, in the 1650s and 60s, both New Hampshire and Massachusetts were controlled as part, New Hampshire and Maine were part of Massachusetts. But I do think that the government was a little more loose in Massachusetts, in Maine, rather than in New Hampshire. I think the Scots were, and their religious practices were probably more tolerated than they would have been in New Hampshire. So they tended to sort of flock here, and very few of them ended up settling in New Hampshire, only a handful. Some of the ones in Exeter did stay there, but most of the ones in Durham and Dover ended up ending up on the Maine side of the river ultimately. But I do think they felt like kindred spirits in northern New England, because Maine and New Hampshire had both started as royalist strongholds, as proprietary colonies that were loyal to the king and the Church of England. Again, they probably had more friends up here than they would have had in Puritan, Massachusetts. Sometimes these folks got in a lot of trouble together. For example, in one meeting of the court in York in 1659, a group of them, John Taylor, James Warren, Peter Grant, their wives, Sandra Cooper, his wife, for using profound speeches in their common talk as making answer to several questions. Their answer is the devil a bet. Essentially, if someone asked one of these guys questions, their answer would be, why don't you ask the devil? He'll answer you. He'll help you. In other words, go to hell. We're not going to give you an answer. Not really popular. Or take Daniel Dill, who at the same session was presented for saying that there were 20 ships of sail coming out of England, and Prince Robert, that is Prince Rupert, was coming to settle a new government. Folks, Prince Rupert of the Rhine was the leading royalist hero, perhaps, of the Civil War. Here he is with his loyal dog Boy, the large hunting poodle who went into battle with him. And the idea of Prince Rupert coming to establish royal government in New England was a dream. Unfortunately for the Scots, it wasn't actually happening. But they still yearned for the good old days, right? They are a very much close-knit group. Those men I just mentioned, they all lived as neighbors in the southern part of what is now South Berwick, mostly what is now today Vaughan Woods State Park. The parish they lived in, where the minister was settled, was called, they named Unity Parish after the ship that they came over on. The town eventually becomes named Berwick, which of course is where the Battle of Dunbar took place, was near the town of Berwick. Also Durham, New Hampshire is named after the Scots who were settled there in commemoration of the cathedral. So they settle together, and many of them settle in that part of York that will become known as Scotland. They intermarry, they sign bonds for each other, they testify in court, they witness each other's will, they're each other's heirs. These comrades in arms suffer through so much together, become family, and in many ways really become a clan. They actually even organized themselves into the Scots Charitable Society, founded in 1657, which is the oldest charitable association in North America. You see here on the left their cemetery lot from the early 19th century at Mount Armoured Cemetery. On the right, you see the first page of their book, including the dues, the list of the members and the dues that they paid. This was an association where people would contribute money that was kept literally in a locked box, when there were Scots in need, prisoners or others, sailors or what have you, they could count on support from the Scottish community. So again, they very much are our community here, right? Well, so that gets us to the current project, which is Landscapes of Indenture, really looking at how the Scottish prisoners of war helped shape New England. And this is an effort led by, well, a bunch of us from the University of New Hampshire, the National Park Service, Durham University, University of St. Andrews, and me from Salem State University. Historians, archaeologists, paleoecologists, material culture experts, curators, cultural resource managers, remote sensing experts. We have pretty much of it all here, folks. Megan Howie, archaeologist at UNH, Mike Pallas and Franklin Sullivan, who are experts in remote sensing. Frankie's our drone pilot. Emily Murphy, curator and historian at Salem and Saugus Ironworks. Gavin Gardner, cultural resource manager and archaeologist. Archaeologist Chris Gerard at Durham University on the other side of the pond. His graduate student, Megan Olszewski, who's currently writing her dissertation on the Scots who ended up at Saugus. Dr. Althea Davies at St. Andrews University, University of St. Andrews, who is our paleoecologist. It's a really great group. We're really trying to sort of see if we can understand these folks and exploring their lives, particularly the relationship between forced labor and environmental change. Note the work these men are doing are extractive industries. Iron making requires burning down lots of wood, harvesting bog iron, lumbering, cod industry. Not many of them get involved in cod fishing, but that's another one as well too. But so, you know, lumbering, ironworking, shipbuilding, cod fishing really are extractive industries that deplete New England of natural resources. And that, as well as farming quickly all through New England's landscape. So one of the goals we have here is to try to reconstruct that changing landscape through sediment cores and examination of pollen. And hopefully we can see that the change of what my friend Jeff Bolster calls America's first clear cut that was taking place in the mid-17th century, in part through the work of the Scots, but as well as many others as well too. We're losing that New England forest and it's being replaced by open farmland. And other resources as well. And you should be able to detect that in the changing natures of pollen. And we're interested too in this changing landscape and the nature of and the role of forced labor. Here's the deal, folks. Ironworking and lumbering is hard, dangerous work. Not many people are going to volunteer to do this, particularly for the low wages that were offered, particularly when there's a labor scarcity in New England, and any free man can go off and start his own farm and essentially be virtually given land. So these men fill a very important need, and as a cheap, controllable labor force. Now, I like to point out that all of the Scots indentures would have been over by 1659. Isn't it interesting that the first record we have of an enslaved African into this region, at least on the Maine side in Kittery, is 1663. And clearly what's happened is they're having to look for other sources of cheap, controllable labor. And it's at this point when northern New England begins to turn, and I think New England in general begins to turn more to enslaved Africans. And that's when you begin to see the rise. And don't kid yourself, these are not all house servants. These are people who are doing the hard, difficult daily grind. And you can see that here. This is in the picture here in the middle of the water here are the remains of the Shapley Tidal Sawmill in Elliott, Maine. Major Nicholas Shapley dies in 1682, and his probate inventory is very extensive. He's a Kittery merchant, a sawmill owner. He's the major in charge of the York County militia. He's also a Quaker and royalist, and even though he's a Quaker, he's an enslaver. His probate inventory in 1682 includes 5 enslaved Africans and 2 Irish boys who were indentured servants with several years left on their contracts. And again, these are not house servants. These people are the force that are operating his tide mill and his shipping operation and his lumbering operation in what is now Elliott, Maine. And you can see this pattern repeatedly. So we're really interested in studying that relationship. We're also too studying the lives of the men. So in Vaughan Woods State Park in South Berwick, you can see actually the cellar hole right here of James Warren, who was one of those Scots. And we're really kind of interested to think about what might that cellar hole have looked like compared to standing structures like this. This is the McIntyre garrison in York, built by John McIntyre, the son of Mickham or Malcolm the Scot. So this is a second generation house. It's probably the oldest standing house in Maine, built about 1707. We'd like to sort of find out more and maybe do some archaeology at some point on some of these sites. Also, too interesting, at this site, right next to the cellar hole, is the Warren Cemetery. And the cemeteries are pretty sparse, just really simple, crude rocks, not much to it. In fact, there is not a surviving marked gravestone, really, carved gravestone in Maine from the 17th century. Interesting thing about the Warrens, we know that Mrs. Warren was Irish. She may have been one of those people sent over as an indenture when Cromwell went over to Ireland. How do we know this? Well, the Warrens' daughter, Christine, was taken captive on the Kachiko raid in 1689. And when she converted to Catholicism and signed the baptismal register, it listed the place of birthplace of her father as Scotland and her mother as Ireland. And we know of other prisoners who married Irish girls, which actually makes sense. Again, people you're going to have more in common with, particularly if you're a Catholic Highlander or a Gaelic speaker, than you would say with anyone else in New England at the time. Their daughter, by the way, Christine, never returned. She married a French Catholic and remained there, though her daughter actually would come back. So we're interested in exploring their burial grounds, and you can see here one marked at the Warren site with one of the few actually even initials on any of these stones. I know of about a half dozen cemeteries, at least in Maine. I should point out, even if you know where some of these are, aside from the state park, you're dealing with public property. So please, a private property. Almost all these cemeteries are on private property. So please, please, please don't assume, but ask permission from property owners before trying to visit any of these sites. Most of them aren't much to see. This is what they look like. This is a very simple cemetery. Doesn't look like much, but you can see if you look carefully, just a few rocks. And that's all you see, with little shallow depressions indicating where they're buried. This is a family cemetery of at least 30 people, 5 generations. So in other words, they've continued to bury their dead this way throughout the 18th century, which to me is truly remarkable, because by that point, you can't say it's because they're poor or there are no stone carvers around. Clearly something cultural going on here, because all of these cemeteries look like this, and has clearly become a tradition and that again, I think is part of that nature of sort of clan sort of and family identity and community here. But they're very simple, and you have to be very careful here, because you wouldn't even know, if you didn't know what you were looking for, you wouldn't know there was a cemetery. So we are interested in landscapes, be they old cellar holes or the way houses and barns were laid out in field patterns, and just to get a sense, so if you're a Scot, you probably want to build a place like the farms at home, what you might have been familiar with and comfortable with. What would that look like? So some of our research will involve looking at what life was like in Scotland in the mid 17th century that these fellows might have replicated here. We're using advanced sophisticated techniques like LiDAR, as you can see here, which really allows you to create really fine-grained 3D maps of elevations, essentially contours. And here we're zooming in on a point in Durham. And if you look as we zoom in, you can see the elevations right there, essentially creating an elevation. And in fact, that area in the distance is a cemetery, actually probably an 18th and 19th century one in this case, not the Scots necessarily. And you can see it here, that circle at the top is that elevated area. So we're using some fairly sophisticated technology here as well to try to find some of these locations. We're also studying these families, looking at their material life, at their artifacts. At the top here is a spoon that was owned by Thomas Holmes, one of the Scots who lived in what is now South Berwick, Maine. But for the most part, we'd like to try to maybe excavate some of these sites. Before we do that, though, and before we locate them, we can even sort of do that and get a sense of these men by excavating their probate inventories. So here is James Warren, who dies in Berwick in 1683. And you can see he has a home stall, an orchard, 120 acres of land, 10 pounds worth of wearing apparel of clothes. That's a decent amount of clothes. 10 pounds would have been, well, maybe, let's put it this way. If when you died, if you left an estate like he did of 150 pounds, this would have been a fairly middling sort, what we'd call a middle-class life. You can see too, look at this. He's growing wheat and barley and Indian corn, what we'd call corn. He's growing peas. He's got pigs. He's got cattle. He's got a musket, a sword, and a belt, and also 2 silver cups. So he's reasonably well off. Silver is very rare back then. So this is someone who's done pretty well. So, here you see his livestock, and again, a bull worth 10 pounds. It's a fair amount of money. Most interesting to me in the probate inventory, look at this. Here's James and his wife never had children. So there's just the 2 of them, in theory, living at the house, maybe a servant or 2, maybe. But look at this. He's got 6 pewter dishes, 12 porringers, 3 Bibles, and some other small books. 2 people don't need 3 Bibles, don't need 12 porringers. So my supposition, I'll never be able to prove it. I think the Grant's home was the meeting place for many of the Scots of South Berwick who might get together on lecture night on Wednesday and Thursday night to read the Bible and maybe to share a meal, a nice bowl of porridge served in a porringer, or perhaps even, I like to dream, maybe it was they're eating Scots oatmeal, right? Can't prove that, but we can maybe try to read between the lines at least a little bit. So I just want to close a little bit by talking about the Scots legacy. They made a lasting impression, particularly in the Piscataqua region. In 1711, we have a muster list for the parish of Berwick. It would become the town of Berwick in 1713. And it's now actually Berwick, South Berwick, and North Berwick. But on this list, 25% of the heads of households in Berwick have Scottish surnames in 1711. So you've got a quarter of your population who are Scots. And again, they stick very much to their neighborhoods, really into the mid-19th century, in some cases even today. One of those cemeteries I showed you earlier, there's still within hailing distance, there are still descendants living on the land granted to the ancestor over 350 years earlier. So they're really presence on the land, quite a legacy. And the problem is many of us don't even realize these are Scottish names when we hear names like Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's Supreme Court Justice, of course, and very famous father as well, or Samuel McIntyre, the master furniture maker, carver, and architect. But these, in fact, are some of the descendants of the Scots. Yes, the Scots even made it to Hollywood. Kate Upton down there at the bottom, her family, the progenitor John Upton, settled in West Peabody. The Upton house is still standing. Might be his son's. And then also many Uptons in North Reading as well. And John Cryer, a number of us on the Landscapes of Indenture team, actually, a few years back on the Learning Channel, did an episode of Who Do You Think You Are with John Cryer, he found out on the show, the format, that he was descended from one of those Scots who's taken prisoner and ended up settling and becoming the first settler of Carlisle, Massachusetts. I will add, what a fun guy to work with. Very, very likable guy. Last one to talk about, William Monroe, settled in Lexington. And 4 generations later, 7 of his descendants, 7 Monroes, probably some other relatives as well, were part of the Lexington militia on April 19th, 1775. And if you ask people in Lexington, particularly members of the Monroe clan, they will tell you that it probably was a Monroe who fired that first shot that started the revolution. Well, no way to prove that, but it would make perfect sense because they'd been fighting off and on with the English for hundreds of years. And also, too, isn't it interesting that on the way out of town, the British did try to burn down the Monroe Tavern, was that in retaliation? The good news is it is owned today by the Lexington Historical Society, and definitely well worth a visit. So in these and so many other ways, I could go on for hours, but if you want to learn more, think you might be related, highly recommend you visit the Scottish Prisoner of War Society website. And also, again, can't recommend highly enough Chris Gerard and company's Lost Lives, New Voices. So that's more than enough for me, but we could keep on talking about this. And the point is, hopefully, we're going to keep on working on this project. We have a grant from the Maine Community Foundation we're working on now. We're hoping to apply for a major grant sometime later on this year. So hopefully we'll be doing this work for the next 2, 3, 4 years, perhaps. So in the end, thank you all very much. And I'll be happy to answer any question. And yes, that's the sunset at the McIntyre Garrison. In an area, by the way, when I brought the English away team from Durham University to see this a few years ago, the first words out of their mouths were, "Oh my God, Tad, it looks just like Scotland," which is something I hadn't even really considered, but it's truly a beautiful place. Anyhow, thank you very much. And
Thank you, Tad.
I'm happy to take questions.
That was great. All right. Thank you so much. You know, the chat was alive throughout that talk with people recognizing places, names from the past, names from the present, and just a beehive of activity and appreciation. So with that in mind, a question I'm going to pull out is, you know, with this vibrant, you know, community of descendants aside, you know, what is the legacy of this group of people? Were they just fully assimilated and they are now kind of, their impact is not clear? They're like the gravestones that have kind of sunk into the ground, only there if you look. Did they play a major role in the separation of Maine from Massachusetts or the Revolution? Like, what is, besides their descendants, their legacy?
Well, I think at the local level, I think they very much sort of become communities of focus. But you know, they do kind of, in some degrees, I think they get really assimilated as a culture. I kind of compare them much later to what happened to German Americans, you know, who between World War I and World War II, no one talks about the German American vote, you know, where families were sort of downplaying those roles. I don't think the Scottish, having said that, I think very, very proud of their heritage. I don't think they ever downplayed it, but it just gets lost. And people don't realize, you know, that a name like Gow or Gowan, or even McIntyre, which should be obvious, you know, or Grant, that these are Scottish names, right? That they're not English, but they've kind of become, I guess, waspified in general, right? You know, so in that sense, I don't think, you know, again, on election night in November, I'm not going to be tuning in to listen to hear what the Scottish vote is up to. Maybe in the House of Commons, right, and over in England. But I do think, I think to some degrees, you know, there is very much of, I think in some degrees that legacy to me, the interesting piece here is the role these folks played. Much like forced labor elsewhere, like there's really kind of their successors in some ways, enslaved Africans. These are in many cases the people who kind of built New England in its origins in the 17th century and were responsible for lots of the backbreaking underpaid labor. I'd also say too, a lot of these fellows have the misfortune, of course, of well, the ones who live, I guess maybe it's not a misfortune, but they also then find themselves fighting on the frontier, King Philip's War and King William's War, and particularly in some degrees, I think the English consider the Scots the early warning system, right? We'll give them the land upriver on the York River, and if the Native Americans ever do come attack, we'll hear the gunfire from the Scots first and have time to save ourselves. You know, they certainly contribute, but and that's to me is trying to explore these lost lives. And as the book says, lost lives, new voices, is to try to give voice to their remarkable lives. And to me, this sense of enduring legacy and fortitude, you just think of the endurance and what these people went through. Again, much like the lives of other indentured servants or enslaved Africans. The fact that they survived, the fact that their family traditions survived, and those who are descendants here, I know, in their families have stories that have been passed down through the generations of how their ancestors survived and what life was like for them. So, you know, in that sense, I think there's a legacy there, but one of our jobs is to try to make sure that people know it.
Well, there are a couple of questions about where people can go. Is there any chance to visit a field site where they might be able to get some instruction about it? What are ways that people can support that field work, and how can they visit it without trespassing? I don't know if you have an active field session in the summer or not.
We do not. this May we were out in the field, and it was a preliminary field season, really doing LiDAR and walkover, trying to locate sites. We're going to continue that work, really sort of analyzing the data from the LiDAR, and hopefully, you know, if we get the grant, we might be doing some field work as early as next summer. We are also, I mean, so, but places where you can see, I mean, first off, visit the Saugus Ironworks by all means. National Park Service, great place, and they know all about the Scots there and can tell you a lot about them. One of ideas we're kicking around is maybe if we do some archaeology in the future, we might try to do some archaeology throughout Saugus, looking at places where the Scots did live, which was not on the grounds of there. You can also the place you can visit. You can it's a state park in South Berwick, Maine. You can walk through Vaughan Woods, and you can see it's a marked site, the location of the as you saw, of the Warren Cemetery in Cellar Hole. And you can aside from that, even all the houses I've shown, everything else is, and the cemeteries are all private. So it's really nothing at this point that's open to the public. But it may be something that we try to do in the future, is to make some of this information more available, particularly available online. But at this point, I would just ask that people sort of respect landowners' privacy. Having said that, what I will say is everybody who we sort of knocked on the door or contacted and sort of said, like, we think there's Scottish folk lived out there in the 17th century and their cemetery might be there, have been incredibly excited and respectful of the resources on their property, even though they're not descendants, you know. And that's always really exciting to see. And as a matter of fact, people show up for some of our talks. So not a lot now. We'll go online, lots of resources, but, you know, stay tuned.
Two kind of related questions. I will link them. Why wasn't the Saugus Ironworks more long-lived? Where did the Scots who had worked there go to? And are any of the South Berwick Scots or any of the Maine Scots associated with settlement in Nova Scotia?
Oh, wow. Wait, I'm sorry. I forgot the first part of that already, Lori.
What happened with the old, the Saugus
Saugus
Ironworks?
Yes, okay, longer. Yes, sorry. So Saugus was not that well engineered, not that well financed, not that well built. Here's the problem. You are trying to carry out a very sophisticated industrial operation. The people who built it originally do not really probably have the expertise needed to really design it properly. They get some of that expertise over time. But also too, you know, if you have some of the sophisticated really hardware and technology you need to make it work is only available back in England. So they're constantly suffering from breakdowns, frankly, from things like lack of skilled labor to run it. And so that doesn't work. I will say, a lot of the Scots who work there, and in fact, there's also some Welsh fellows who work there as well too. That is one of the pieces of the legacy that Saugus likes to talk about, is that these men, who are really the first iron makers in what is now the United States, really, will go and establish foundries in other places throughout New England. And in this sense, the people who worked at Saugus, including many of the Scots, will continue to work in that industry and throughout the region, and it's sort of part of that legacy. And of course, others will end up many who work in the lumber industry. We'll see multiple generations out continuing to work in logging and lumbering as well. Now, I do not know about any of them being part of like the loyalists that end up in New Brunswick or Nova Scotia. It's certainly quite possible. Anybody who was a loyalist, of course, in Massachusetts in the 1770s, a lot of them ended up that way. The other question is, that I'm often asked related to that, is, what's the relationship between these folks and the Ulster Scots, who of course come over in 1718, the Scottish settlers who in the early 17th century, mid 17th century, end up in Ulster in Ireland, and then in 1718, when they're persecuted there by the Church of Ireland, end up moving to New England. They are a separate group, obviously, but there are some connections between them. And for example, I've come across one of the grandsons, actually, of George Grey, who's one of the Scots from Dunbar and is in South Berwick. One of his grandsons actually ends up marrying I believe it's a daughter of one of the Ulster Scots up in mid-coastal Maine. So there are some connections there between the folks who end up in places like Derry and Londonderry and the Kennebec River in the 17 teens and 20s.
We have a question about how many, if there was an equivalent number of Irish people who might have been shipped over here against their will as well. And that I'm going to link that to a question about how the Protestant Congregationalists, Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and in the other colonies at the time felt about having a loyalist Catholic fringe on a frontier they felt was precarious because it was already near New France and the Catholic French up in what is now Canada. Did they take any steps to protect themselves from this group? Was there ever an issue with the Scots or Catholic Irish forming any designs?
Well, I could quickly turn this into a Salem witch trials talk, but I won't. Suffice it to say that the Puritans were paranoid about the frontier because it was the dark countries to the north, the dark corners of piety, places where the devil and his minions lived, and also where the French were in Acadia and New France. And I think to some degrees they treated this place very much as a borderland, and probably just fine to have the Scots up there. Though again, I think always a little bit worried about what they might be up to, and even more so when you begin to have some of the French arrive as well too, and the Irish. And again, the other thing too is, Laura, as you mentioned about this whole group, whether they be Irish or Scottish with these largely Gaelic names. One reason that they do disappear, kind of, is because the English, like with Native American names, are just really good at butchering these names. And if you look at their efforts to spell them and pronounce them in the 17th century, frankly, one reason it's hard for us to even trace these people is because the names get drastically changed and they don't quite get the Ellis Island treatment, but something in that vicinity. But there don't seem to be any steps particularly to prevent any of these people from moving to the frontier. And I think by the time the Ulster Scots come in, they're considered to be, loyal enough and Protestant enough, and they're looking to settle the frontier that they will certainly take advantage of that.
Are these prisoners of war remembered at all in Scotland? Someone is asking, is there a society in Scotland that also remembers them?
Absolutely. If you go, on that trip back in 2017, my wife and I did travel north to Dunbar to visit Doon Hill and the site of the battle. And there are a couple of memorials there. One actually dating to the time of Thomas Carlyle and another much more recent. So they are commemorated there. And again, like if check out the Scottish Prisoner of War website, and you'll see on that. And there are groups that reenact actually, some of these battles and reenact these Scottish regiments to honor them and their memory as well. So that effort, I think, is very much alive. And I will say too, came to the fore when the mass graves were discovered. There was a huge interest in the Scottish community in Scotland and in England to properly honor these war dead.
Someone is asking, you brought up Salem, so now there's a follow-on.
Sorry.
You know what a what a ball gets rolling with that. Scots didn't seem to be involved in the witch concern. I hate to say mania or hysteria anymore. Why would that be that they were able to remain outside of that?
Well, I think in part because the simple truth is there were very few in Salem Village, or Andover, and essentially where most of the accusations took place. I'd have to double check and see. There were some peripherally involved, but none that I can think of off the top of my head who were accused. Certainly, any foreigner was likely to be accused. I do know of several who did testify, but none that I know who were. One who testified, a couple who testified against Bridget Bishop, for example, the John Blythe and his wife, or Blythe, and actually it's their great grandson who's the charcoalist, the portrait painter who paints the famous portraits in Salem of John and Abigail Adams. But let's put it this way: it's one of these things where I think if the witch trials had kept going, the Scots would have been different enough at the time where I'm sure some of them would have gotten accused, and they probably counted themselves lucky, especially when they were sort of one of those outside elements. I think there were maybe larger prey in 1692. So, for example, the people who were picked on were the current enemies. There were a fair number of French Huguenots and Channel Islanders from Jersey and Guernsey who were French speakers, even though English subjects. And there was a real panic in 1690 that they were going to rise up in rebellion along with the French to the north. So I think most of the energy, a lot of the energy for foreigners fell to them, fell to Native Americans who were at war with, and also sadly to enslaved Africans as well. So there were probably maybe enough enemies to go around at that point. And I will say, if you look at some of those French speakers, look at people like Philip English and some of the wives of some of the Channel Islanders who were accused of witchcraft. So I guess the devil you know versus the devil you don't.
We see that they had no qualms, apparently, at least some of them, about enslaving African people and probably indigenous Wabanaki people or whoever may have been living right there in that place. Do we have a lot of their own words that would explain their actions or their feelings? Or I'm getting the feeling we probably don't have a lot of written documents from these actual people.
No, we've really very few. One of the things that I really want to look at closely in this project are their wills. Now, the problem is, of course, most of these are young lads. We know from the mass grave that most of these fellows were between about like 14 and the early 20s. So probably a lot of them didn't have a lot of schooling. People in Maine in the 17th century, particularly working class folks like these, low even signature literacy rate. So most of these fellows, are marking their wills even with an X. So they don't have a lot left in writing. What we see, unfortunately, in those cases are things like the court records, which is, not necessarily the way people want to be remembered. But I'm really interested in studying their wills, Lori, because think about this. Has anyone ever studied 17th century New England wills? If you can think of any document, to some degrees, there's some boilerplate there, but if anything gives you an idea of what people's religious beliefs might have been and whether they might have been a Puritan or a Presbyterian or someone with Catholic leanings, should be right there in their will, right? So that's one thing that I'd like to see a study, but for the most part, yeah, and very little. And in fact, to the point, and of course, even their wives, we know in many cases we know next to nothing about their wives, though in many cases they would intermarry. Sometimes, some of the daughters of the Scots would marry an old comrade-in-arms or the son of a comrade-in-arms. But one of the reasons we turn to, I guess the short answer is I should have said up front, one reason we turn to archaeology for these folks is because this is an audience, a population that is fairly inarticulate. These men and their women and their wives and their families, they don't leave a lot of written records. So sometimes we literally have to try to dig it up as best we can.
One nearly infallible source is land deeds, since land was always being taken from indigenous people. Maine still maintains that reputation as a frontier, but they must have had the land deeds, which leads me to another question, which is, what do we have of recorded indigenous impressions or these people or relationships with them or interactions?
Yeah, I'd love to know that. I should say, yeah, what's interesting is, of course, by the time these Scots arrive and have the chance to buy land from the Native Americans, it's pretty much all been bought up. So I don't, I really do, and again, our encounters with Native Americans in this neck of the woods that are written down are few and far between. I would love to have been a fly on the wall and have an idea as to what those relationships would have been like. And actually, there's an interesting book. It's by Colin Calloway, who of course is a very talented Native American historian, who's also of Scottish heritage, who wrote a really interesting book. And unfortunately, it's mostly looking at the Scots and the Ulster Scots in the South in the 18th century, but it looks at them and their relationship and there's similarities to the native population of the South. And so that's, to some degrees, if you're really interested in that question, I would highly recommend that book. I wish I could do the kinds of things that Colin could do for the people up here, because there certainly had to be relationships between the Native American population. I will say though too, again, there's by this time they arrived here in the 1650s, in places like Salem and Saugus, and even in southern Maine, the native population is getting pretty sparse. They're now certainly a presence here, absolutely, and so the Scots would have known these folks. And again, one likes to think that they would have had, in some ways, a lot in common as being kind of outsiders. But for the most part, I really wish I knew. I will say too, you mentioned about enslavers. We know, I think, of at least one former Scottish prisoner of war who does have one or two enslaved Africans later on. Unfortunately, that sort of experience didn't necessarily stop them from doing something that we might consider, really out of bounds. So that's, I believe me, and I've studied Native Americans in this region. I keep on looking for any possible openings there, Lori, I assure you, but to date, it's just an interesting possibility. The only time unfortunately, the only time we see the encounters is during the attacks, but even then, if I could look at some of the captivity narratives, maybe that's the only time they seem to come into play. And even then, those are like, we know a little bit about some of the captives who were some of the Scottish families, but really no even sort of captivity narratives from them. But it would be fascinating to figure it out.
Just got a question. Are there any plans to exhibit more of this information in the Piscataqua region?
Not immediately. However, I should have mentioned, I am remiss, that if you go to the Saugus Ironworks, there was a traveling exhibit put together a few years ago by Durham University called the project was called The Long Way from Home. And it was a traveling exhibit on the Scottish prisoners of war. And that has been installed inside the museum at the Saugus Ironworks. So you can certainly see that there. I can also tell you that if you go, for example, to Old York Historical Society, you can see a couple items. For example, oh gosh, they're going to shoot me. I can't remember if it's McIntyre or Junkins. I think it's the McIntyre family cradle, but it might be Junkins. Someone will correct me as to which one it is. But there are some artifacts related to this, a couple of artifacts related to the Scots there. And Old Berwick is very much interested in telling the Scots story. And even though there are no particular artifacts related to them on exhibit now, again, maybe we'll do an exhibit soon, or hopefully sometime in the future, about some of the artifacts that we might be able to dig up. So again, nothing right here, right now, but stay tuned.
Okay. You just reminded me, someone is saying it is the Junkins cradle. Somebody put in a question about Junkins in the chat that I cannot find again. Can you repost it, whoever you were? Someone had a question before you were done, and I can't scroll back to find it now because we've had so many chats. So if someone will repost.
I should say the Junkins and the McIntyres were neighbors in York, and both have very active family associations, clans. And in fact, actually, any McIntyres out there, I'll actually be speaking at the McIntyre Family Association meeting here in York.
That's been mentioned. They're already on it. I believe it's been reposted. Thank you. Where is the Junkins Garrison House? Oh, the question was, what happened to the Junkins Fort? That was, thank you for reposting that. What happened to the fort, and where's the house? The garrison.
So there are multiple, probably Junkins garrisons, maybe. The original Scotland garrison sat at the top of the hill, right where on the north side of the York River on what's now Route 91, the 17th century, the road to Newachawanek. At the top of that, if you in the Scotland district, if you're coming from the north, from South Berwick, on your right, you will pass the McIntyre garrison, again, in private ownership, but it's clearly visible right there on your right, just at the base of the hill. And as you go up the hill, at the top of the hill is where the Junkins garrison was on the left. right behind the Junkin Cemetery, which is right by the road now, and you can see at the top of the hill. Be careful. People drive like bats out of hell on that road, and there's really no place to pull over there. Even if you slow down, make sure there's no one behind you, because it's a dangerous place. There probably was an earlier garrison to the right-hand side across the street from the Junkin's garrison. Junkin's garrison and the McIntyre garrison were literally within shooting distance of each other, designed to be that way so they could defend each other. We think both were built in the early 18th century. And again, there probably was a large palisaded garrison, I suspect, across the street earlier. Sadly, the Junkin's garrison was abandoned, and the family lived in the area and lived in other houses starting in the mid-18th century. And by the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, the Junkin's garrison was sort of this majestic wreck. And there are all kinds of wonderful photographs, but also paintings of it showing it in ruin. And I think it finally was burned down maybe in the late 1880s. Somehow I think it was on Halloween, believe it or not, Lori, but I can't remember. Anyhow, it ended up being a derelict that was torn down, because again, here's the problem. Who wants to live in a 17th century garrison house? To us, it sounds kind of cool, but I think people in the 19th century probably figured it was a little overrated, especially when you're talking about a sawn log garrison where the walls of your house are like a foot thick, made out of solid wood, dovetailed boards and beams. And, not really, you can't really sort of be like, on these home improvement show, like saying, let's knock out this wall.
Once again, I'm going to link a couple of ideas here. Did these people, once their indentures were fulfilled, make attempts to bring over their family members? You talked about them not returning. Did they make attempts to bring people over once they were in a position to do so? And I'm linking that to the question of, once their own indentures had been fulfilled, have you found any explicit discussion of the need for other people to be cheap labor, whether indentured or enslaved?
No, so like I said, that verse, no distinct linkages between the two. But I think, to me, again, I'd like to chart this out, the growth of slavery in New England, particularly northern New England, in the 1660s onward, and I think you'll find it's reasonably substantial. Oh gosh, and what was the other? I'm sorry, what was the other piece?
And do you have any records? And I know records are kind of scarce, of people, some of these Scots attempting to bring people over their own families.
Oh, yeah. So interesting. Very scant information on that. There is a very strong tradition, supported by some documentation, in the Hamilton family, that the Hamilton who was taken captive, whose actually great grandson built Hamilton House in South Berwick. He established himself originally across the river in what's now Rollinsford, New Hampshire. And if you read the family genealogy, particularly, it's actually the Hamiltons of Waterboro, because the branch of the family ends up in Waterboro, Maine. There's a very strong tradition backed with some tantalizing documentation that David Hamilton brought over his sweetheart from Scotland after he was free, or that she basically made her way over to be with him. And it's hard to tell, and it sounds kind of like almost like a colonial revival sort of romance, right? But if you read the genealogy, there are a couple sort of smoking guns there to suggest that David Hamilton was member of a very well-placed, prominent branch of the Hamilton family, who may have had the ability to get a fiance over to the New World, and to make sure that she was treated right. But unfortunately, in most of these cases, we don't even know the maiden names of the wives. This is one of the big, Laura, it's one of the big frustrations in trying to deal with 17th century and issues of gender and women, because you just lose track, because if you don't have the maiden name, or if you can't link the maiden name to the marriage record, almost impossible to even figure out who these women are. I do think the one thing I should have mentioned, one thing that they did have done on the is one of the big avenues right now that to me is incredibly exciting, is DNA research. And there has been so there's some of the organizations in New England that are affiliated with Scots. Like I know the New Hampshire Scots Association, I believe has done some work on DNA work. I think some of the individual families and clans may be undertaking DNA work too, to try to link themselves back. We also even do know that they have done complete, Durham University has done complete DNA analysis on the Scots from mass grave before they reburied. We do know amongst those 28 that some of them were close relatives. And so it's also quite possible, one of the things we're hoping we might be able to do is do some kind of DNA project where we could compare DNA to the well, not descendants, but to the population over here of descendants of the Scottish prisoners of war, and see perhaps if we could trace where they are from back in Scotland, or are they related specifically to any of the victims whose DNA we already have? Because we do know in many cases, what happened was, essentially we think the Scottish army, kind of the men responsible, sort of the knock on the doors, give us one of your sons, and you'd have maybe multiple members of a family or a clan or a neighborhood, one boy, one teenager from each family. So it could well be possible. I'm not a genealogist, especially not a DNA genealogist, but I do know that to me this is one of the more exciting avenues in this kind of research, is that we might be able to figure out exactly who some of these folks are and exactly where they came from, and maybe that could go for some of the female DNA as well too.
Well, I think you have a potential DNA army attending tonight. So if you ever do set up a DNA project, put it on that SPOWs.org website so these people can find it. We have another question about relations with Indigenous people. Two questions again. One is, what was the impact of King Philip's War? We know that after the English side was pretty much defeated in southern New England, they took it up to northern New England and brought havoc up there after after a truce had been verbally agreed on. And so what was the impact on this particular group who were in Maine? And I think I'll keep it.
Yeah, King Philip's War was interesting. In northern New England, of course, it was different. Northern New England, actually, the English had to sort of sign a treaty, which in 1677 and 78, which was favorable to Native Americans. They were supposed to give a peck of corn as tribute annually to the native peoples of northern New England, as opposed to southern New England, which really is disastrous defeat for King Philip and his family and their forces. And many of them, of course, some being executed, some being shipped into enslavement in the Caribbean. And in northern New England, it's not quite so bad, though. Again, unfortunately, a lot of the warriors at the end of the war who had retreated to southern Maine in coastal New Hampshire were actually victims of what's known as Waldron's treachery, where several hundred of the warriors were taken captive under basically false flag of truce, false pretenses. The story Native Americans might say has a happy ending, because of course, really the first English victim of King William's War is Richard Waldron, where the Native Americans basically single him out in his home as the place to start the attack on Cocheco in 1689 to settle the score with him. There is a remnant native population in the Piscataqua after King Philip's War, 1670s, 1680s. But again, very narrow window there, because once King William's War starts in 1688, 1689, which really starts off, before it's a war with France, it's a war with the native peoples of northern New England and the English settlers. Again, the only kind of records we have are those accounts during the war and of the raids. And frankly, by the time that generation of war is over, that war ends in 1697. Queen Anne's War starts in 1701, ends in 1713. And after 1713, the only native presence you see in this part of northern New England are really kind of refugees who come back and visit the area, maybe in the summer to go hunting and fishing. The year-round presence is very fleeting. And I want to say no, they did not completely disappear. I mean, we do have the myth of, there's always in every town, there's the myth of the last Native American who, they died And of course, well, they died, but they were left at this English home by their family, when they were traveling through the area. So, there remains a native presence, but it largely goes underground and becomes seasonal. And for those kinds of reasons, don't show up great in the historic record. Where you do see this, frankly, honestly, is the native peoples of northern New England, the various Wabanaki groups of our area, who still have those traditions in their families of where their families came from and where they visited. So I think there's a rich well of Native American tradition and oral history there that is helping to sort of fill in some of those blanks, at least. And shame on the historian who doesn't listen carefully to that tradition simply because it wasn't written by some historian with a bunch of letters after their name, if you know what I mean.
I do know what you mean. I think that is going to be a fantastic note to end on for now. This discussion obviously continues. So thanks again so much, Tad, for this talk. Everyone enjoyed it so much. I just have to, before we go, and you all run off to spows.org, talk to you briefly about what else is coming up. Our next event that the Partnership of Historic Bostons is sponsoring is a special tour of the Congregational Library and Archive in Boston on July 19th. That's a Wednesday from 2 to 4. This is an in-person visit. And the Congregational Library and Archive is the national or international headquarters for research on Congregationalism. It's an independent research library. It's been open to the public since 1853. And when you go there to browse its enormous stacks and look at, its beautiful reading room, you realize that Congregationalism, which is the religion of the Puritans, had a powerful impact on what became American society, politics, as well as religion. And so this is going to be an amazing tour of that site with a special focus on New England's Hidden Histories, which is a public history project to digitize church records where you can get tons of information from all over what is now New England, from 1630s to the 1880s on a huge range of people. So if you think, well, nobody in my family was congregational, go take a look at NEHH at the Congregational website, or come on this tour. There's only 20 spaces that we have open for this free tour. So get on to that as quick as you can. And I'm going to put the link to the website where you can sign up right into the chat right now. And then we look ahead to the fall on September 20th. Dr. Adrienne Weimer, who's a professor of history at Providence College, is going to be our wonderful guest, talking about her recent book, A Constitutional Culture, New England and the Struggle Against Arbitrary Rule. And this picks up from what you will learn at the Congregational Library, that New England very early on developed a very unique culture that was dedicated to representative local government, religious independence, and individual rights enshrined in law. And the restoration of the monarchy in England in 1660, one of its goals was to wreak havoc on all of that. So that would have definitely been on the minds of people down in southern New England, where all those Catholic nuts were up in northern New England. That's going to be on September 20th, again in the evening, a virtual talk. So if you go to historicbostons.org, very soon there's going to be a link up to register for that. So thank you everyone who attended. Thank you everyone who has donated. We appreciate your donations so very much. You can donate on our website. And we thank Ted once again. Be in touch with him through the website. And everyone, thanks for coming and have a good evening.